Let me encourage the people in the entryway to come on in, join us before we close the doors. Find a seat. There are plenty of seats, and I know we'll fill back up here. Good morning. I want to welcome you again to the Tribune's 86th legislative session preview. I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Tribune. It is not true, as Bob Garrett of the Dallas Morning News suggested, that I slept in this morning and only just rolled in now on my bird scooter. I was sorry not to be here for the beginning of the day, but I'm going to make up for it by moderating the next three conversations. And I want to thank Daniel Becca and the Texas Exes again. Could you give the Exes a hand again for letting us squat in their space today? What a perfect space to be here gathered to talk about important matters. We're glad to have the opportunity to be on this campus. So I'm Evan Smith, as I said, and I am pleased to lead our next panel discussion about the agenda for the Texas House in the 86th session. Atypically, following an election season in the modern era of this great state, we have something to look forward to other than same song, different verse. Change is legitimately coming to the lower chamber of the legislature. A narrower partisan split between Republicans and Democrats, a renewed interest in bread and butter issues at the likely expense of the fabled sharp objects on the table, and most critically, a new speaker. To discuss all this and more, I'm fortunate to be joined by 4 House members reelected on November 6th, 3 overwhelmingly, 1 by a narrower margin than he would have liked.
I thought you had a big margin.
No. No. Yeah, I'm talking about you. We'll get to that. On my immediate left is Rafael Anchia, Democrat of Dallas, in his 7th term representing District 123. In the 85th legislature, he chaired, 103, pardon me. In the 85th legislature, he chairs the International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, sits on the Pensions Committee. Born and raised in Miami, he has an undergraduate degree from SMU and a law degree from Tulane University. Matt Krause, Republican of Fort Worth, has represented District 93 since 2012. In the 85th session, he serves on Culture, Recreation, and Tourism and Land and Resource Management committees. He's a native of Tyler. He has an undergraduate degree from Christian Heritage College and a law degree from Liberty University. Geanie Morrison, Republican of Victoria, will soon begin her 10th term representing District 30. This session, she chairs the Transportation Committee, serves on the Higher Ed Committee. A native of Victoria, she attended Victoria College. And finally, Shawn, Thierry, Democrat of Houston, first elected in 2016 to represent District 146. In the 85th session, she serves on the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues and County Affairs Committees. A native of Houston, she has an undergraduate degree from Howard University and a law degree from Texas Southern University. Please give these 4 a big hand, welcome them, and thank them for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you from me as well. And before we get into a conversation about the House agenda, let's talk about the House. Because the agenda will be determined by the House, and the House will be, as I alluded to, different this time than last time. Chair Morrison, the House last time was 95-55 Republican-Democrat. This time it's 83-67 Republican and Democrat. You all still have a majority. You all still can do anything you want without the vote of a single Democrat if you hold your votes together, and Democrats can't prevent anything that you want to do. But 83-67 is different from 95-55, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it is. Sorry. Absolutely it is. But when I first came in the House in my first session in 1999, I was in the minority.
Right.
So, you know, I have been through sessions of being in the minority and having a large majority and having a very close majority. So, yes, I mean, it's the same issue. We are going to be working and representing our districts and doing the business of the state of Texas, and we will all work together. I mean, and I'm looking forward to it.
Chair, is it the case, though, that when you look at that split, I mean, honestly, if the 67 Democrats are able to hold their votes together, and let's not assume that they can. These are, after all, Texas Democrats, right?
Right.
We're assuming that they have to have their act together, but let's assume that they do have their act together. All they need is 9 or 10 wayward Republicans, 9 or 10 Sarah Davises to wander off the reservation, and they can keep you all from anything that you want to do. I mean, doesn't that give you some pause in terms of what might be on the agenda?
Well, I think, you know, as you look at the House rules are set up so that we all have a say in what's going on in the legislature.
Right.
and we're representing our districts. And you'll see coalitions on a lot of different issues, on transportation, on education, depending on what your district is. You work with like-minded members, whether they're R's or D's. And so you see a lot of coalitions every session, but I think you will see even more so this time.
Right. Representative Anchia, your party won 12 seats in the House. That's the most that you've won in any cycle, won some seats in the Senate, won a couple congressional races that up until this cycle at least had not been viewed as competitive, held statewide Republicans to narrower margins in their victories than you've done in a very long time. It's a good year for the Democrats. Question is, what are you going to do with that? How do you leverage what the voters seem to be suggesting on November 6th forward into next year?
Well, I think you'll see it manifested more in the People's House, right? The House of Representatives is the one that's going to be most responsive, in my view, to that kind of dramatic sea change and really the blue wave that did hit Texas. None other than John Cornyn acknowledged, I think yesterday or the day before, that this is no longer a red state, that this is a purple state. And I think
you agree with that?
I do. Oh, no question. I think it has been for a long time. It had been a non-voting state, and suddenly with the energy that President Trump and Beto O'Rourke created, along with good candidates up and down the ballot, from judge to state representative to state senator to Congress, you saw that manifested in higher numbers. And it just wasn't the Beto race. I mean, Governor Abbott won by a very, very narrow margin vis-a-vis Wendy Davis and Bill White.
13.3 points, but not 20 points.
Right. And you know, he was, I think the governor was going into this election cycle looking to spike the ball and, you know, really doing well with Hispanic voters, and he actually didn't do as well as he expected. And you've heard sort of a muted response from the governor and from Republicans. Now, there are a number of Republicans in the House that won by, you know, less than 1,000 votes. And I think that causes people to, instead of seeing their entire path to re-election through a Republican primary, they see it through a more ecumenical prism and a general election. And I think that is going to moderate people's behavior. The final thing is that I think will impact us in the House is that you have a governor that is not looking over his shoulder at the lieutenant governor running against him in the upcoming election.
How do you know, and why do you assume that 4 years from now that will not be the square off?
It may be 4 years ago, but it's not. But there'll be right. But there'll be two sessions. I won't say that that's not the case in 2020. But for this session,
it's just not an immediate threat.
It's not an immediate threat, and I think the governor will act differently. I mean, we saw him really cower every time the lieutenant governor, you know, sort of threw something over the transom, and that really impacted the way we worked in the House.
Let me ask Representative Thierry and Krause about two other byproducts of these elections that are geographic in nature that feed into this session. Representative Thierry, you're from Harris County.
Yes.
In 2012, in the presidential race, Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney by fewer than 1,000 votes in Harris County. In 2016, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 161,000 votes in Harris County. And this year, Beto O'Rourke beat Ted Cruz by more than 200,000 votes in Harris County. What does the bluing of Harris County and the bluing of the big cities generally tell you about the power of your elected members and the agenda for this session? What do you take from that message from the voters?
Thank you. I think that it's really going to just set the tone statewide, that as Representative Anchia said, that we are shifting. My purpose, though, and my focus I really, really hope this session that we go into this with our sleeves rolled up, ready to work in a bipartisan manner. So even though we have our number of D's and R's, there are some serious issues that we've all got to tackle.
Yep.
And I think this time we will not get caught up in the culture wars. We know we have to do something about our school finance system. So we have 67 Dems, we've got 83 R's. We all have to bring that back home to our district with a win.
You make an assumption, Representative Thierry, that social, as you refer to them, social issues or cultural issues are not going to be on the table, so we're not going to see legislation around who gets to enter and exit bathrooms. We're not going to see.
They may be, but we have an opportunity to be magnanimous now with a new speaker to set the tone and take the lead and keep our eye on the prize.
Reset, start over, and bread and butter issues.
Absolutely.
Representative Krause, we've had this conversation once already this week about what happened in Tarrant County. Tarrant County is the most conservative large county in America, or was. No Democrat running on the statewide ballot, and Ken Herman will fact check me on this, I'm sure, has won Tarrant, Dallas, Harris, Bear, and Travis in an election cycle since LBJ in 1964 until Beto O'Rourke in 2018, who amazingly won Tarrant County. Tied Ted Cruz, in essence, on early vote, and then actually won Tarrant County outright on Election Day, and ultimately won Tarrant County. And all across Tarrant County, there were outcomes in elections that we were not predicting, much closer races, including yours. Connie Burton lost the Senate race. What happened to Tarrant County, and is Tarrant County an augur of something that, again, feeds into the tone and the agenda of this session? If Tarrant County can go blue, will the agenda shift necessarily off of that?
Yeah, well, I thought you asked me a good question earlier in the week. You said, did Democrats win or did Republicans lose? And I think in Tarrant County, you saw kind of both of that happen, right? Democrats way overperformed anything that anybody thought was going to happen. The fact that Beto O'Rourke won Tarrant County, I think was a shock to everybody. Maybe not the O'Rourke campaign because they could see that coming, but it certainly was to all the outside observers. And then you coupled that with, I'm sure Republicans took it a little for granted. I know I thought, oh yeah, we're going to win. Even if it's a little closer, we're going to be fine. And I think now you're going to have to calibrate that thinking. No longer can you say, okay, as Representative Chia said, as long as I get through the primary, I should be okay. Hey, I could have a tough primary and I could have a tough general election. And I think we've already seen that with some of the elected officials in Tarrant County, even some of the most conservative people saying, hey, it was a good wake-up call. We're going to have to still fight for our principles, but maybe do it in a different tone and tenor than we have before. So now we have
Representative Jonathan Stickland, our kumbaya, right? All of a sudden now, if Stickland wants to get along with everybody, you know that the election had a different outcome, right? But let me stay to this point. So, you won by a narrower margin than one would have expected, and a number of your colleagues in those, in Tarrant and in the surrounding areas really barely escaped. Shaheen, Leach, Stickland won but didn't even get to 50%. So if base politics no longer work from the standpoint of getting elected, do base politics necessarily work any longer in a session? I mean, it's sort of Representative Thierry's point, that we don't really have the same opportunity to talk about these things that are base-pleasing issues when you're worried about whether you get reelected the next time.
Yeah, well, I think there's certain issues that hopefully you put forth and advocate whether you get reelected or not. And I think you'll always have those like pro-life issues. For some of us, it's an animating principle of why we do what we do. And so you're always going to see some pro-life issues that are advocated for or pushed. But I do think you're going to see that it was kind of realization, as Representative Thierry said, you know what, we got to work on property taxes. We got to work on school finance. That's where our focus and energy needs to go. And as long as we're doing that, we can go back home to our voters and to our constituents and say we did the job we're supposed to do.
Chair Morrison, when Speaker Presumptive Bonin came out and said in that world's shortest press conference ever that, I have the votes, and he basically has said either then or subsequently, my priority is school finance, public education. That was met with resounding huzzas by both Democrats and Republicans. Do you really believe that's going to be the number one priority of this session?
Absolutely. That's what our constituents want. That's what we need to work on. We have to address school finance. We have to address property taxes. Without doing school finance.
And you see those two as unengageable as issues. Those two, you can't do one without the other.
Absolutely, because you can't fix school finance if you don't address property taxes because it's all intertwined.
Right.
And so you have to do that.
If I were a Texan who had been watching casually the legislature the last several sessions, I would have heard before, Ms. Morrison, a speaker say, public education is our priority. It's a little bit like Lucy and Charlie Brown and the football. At the beginning of the session, leadership puts the football down, and then the legislature gavels in, and all of a sudden football goes up and Charlie Brown is flat on his back. Why should we believe you, not you personally, but you royally, when you say public education is our priority? Why should we believe you now any more than we should have believed you previously?
Because I think that, that's what my constituents want. That's what I have told the soon-to-be speaker is my number one priority.
Right.
I think you're going to have most members say, that is our number one priority, and we have to fix it.
Yeah, Representative Chia, are you any more in the same in that place that you believe that public ed will be the number one agenda item?
I was a former school board member who ran for the House back in 2004 because I thought we were going to have a conversation about solving school finance, and we did it over. I want to say we had 2 sessions in 2005 and 2 in 2006, and it wasn't until 2006 that we did this franchise tax shift. That we even addressed the issue. Now, look, I saw Jimmy Don Aycock, who was really earnest about getting something done with a lot of, we were in a great economy. He came to the House floor with a bill, and he got a standing ovation for pulling the bill, right? So we had the political will, we had the money, but the Senate wasn't there with us. So he pulled the bill because he didn't want people to have to vote on it. The only time, whether it's been Dixiecrats or Democrats or Republicans controlling the legislature, the only time we've gotten anything done on school finance is through the courts, period, full stop. It's the only time the Lionhearts in the legislature say we will have the political will. It's because the courts say we have an unconstitutional system and you have to do it. Yeah. You have to do it. Now, I happen to think our current system is unconstitutional, at least on one ground, which is that we do not have a state-funded system because the state only is responsible for about 36% of the total system. We should be at 50.1%, so I think we are de facto unconstitutional. But until a court says that, I think it will be very difficult. What I fear about this session is that we're really not going to do a reform that will drive more money to public schools. We will simply do a tax shift using revenue simply to buy down local property tax and increase the state share, but do nothing about driving more money into the classroom. That's what I fear.
Representative Thierry, you're from Harris County. Like Travis County, Harris County and Houston, Travis County and Austin have had complicated relationships with recapture, right, with the current system. So there's an assumption on the part of most people that that needs to be blown up. Are you there? Not yet, because I come from a county where people call us property wealthy, HIC, the district that I represent. However, 80% of the students in my district are on free lunch. So until we come up with a system at the legislature, I'm not ready to throw in the towel. We're struggling in HISD. I don't want to have to make those payments, but I don't know the alternative right now. I'm thinking of creative ways. Everybody is doing it. I pre-filed a bill to increase the tax on cigarettes. It's not going to make me popular. I want 25 cents extra on cigarettes to go into our public school education, public school fund. It's literally robbing Peter to pay Paul, as Representative Anchia said. We don't have enough funding, but we've got to come up with better ways. So your assumption, regardless of whether it's blowing up recapture and starting over or some other way to change the funding mechanism, your assumption is it's got to be more money. At the end of the day, the solution is more money. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's what it comes down to. We've kicked the can down the road as far as we can. We don't have enough money. We're, almost last in the nation, I think third to last on how much we fund per pupil. So well, we're in the bottom tier of something. Right, yeah. Well, but so Representative Thierry, let me hold you accountable in the way that we want to hold people accountable in this situation and say if you want to spend more money on public education, we don't have unlimited amounts of money. Since you acknowledge that your plan to tax cigarettes is not likely to go anywhere, where are you going to stop spending in order to reallocate money for public ed? Well, we've seen so far, we've been saying for a long time that border security in Texas was a federal issue. Looks like now our president kind of has that under control. Maybe we could pull some money away from there. I think it's about $800 million or more. That's not enough, but we can start looking at different pockets. That's not our responsibility in Texas. We need to fund and take care of our kids that are on this side of the border right now and educate them. Yeah, that's something we could start with right now. So that would be one thing. Representative Krause, I'm used to talking to conservative members of the Republican Party, the most conservative members of which you are one, and hearing them say, I'm reluctant to spend more money on public education unless public education can justify that it is spending the money that we're spending now efficiently and wisely. Are you in that camp?
Well, can I address your question first about why I would be optimistic that we're actually going to do school finance this time? By all means. Just real quick, because I think last session, past couple sessions, when the speaker said we need to focus on education, whatever that is, he was looking at House Bill 21 or what that was last session. When Dan Patrick said we need to focus on education, it was ESAs or charter schools. When the governor was talking about education, it was pre-K. And so you had the same buzzword, but not the same goal. I think this time all three bodies are aligned with the school finance system. And since we're all going towards the actual same goal this time, I think that can help us.
So you have, just to that point, before you answer the question I asked, but since you brought up the Senate's role in all this, what killed, from my perspective, the Huberty Bill 21 last time, was that the Senate said we're not going to do school finance without, school choice. Big air quotes around that because different people define that phrase differently. Basically, you don't do vouchers, we're not going to do school finance, and ultimately everything went away because there was no way to bridge the difference on that. There's a theory, back to my first question, that the change in the composition of the House means that if vouchers were not going to pass last time, they're not going to pass this time. So do you have any reason to think that the Senate's going to get off that stick and that we're not suddenly going to be back where we were 2 Mays ago, this May coming up? saying if we don't do some kind of vouchers or ESAs that we're not going to do school finance? You're optimistic that that's not going to be the problem?
Yeah, so if I can answer the question that you asked me after the question
Oh
that
my
I
God.
asked before
Somebody
that.
go back and transcribe this. This is just...
I think on House Bill 21, it wasn't just that you weren't having ESAs or school choice attached with it. I think it was writing checks that you couldn't cash. It was shells and budgetary gimmickry to try to get to that goal. So I don't think it was just that they weren't decoupled, but I think right now with the School Finance Commission, that's where the goal is from what I've understood from the Senate as well as the House. And so I don't think you're going to have, or if you're going to get this, you're going to have to give us that, or if we're going to do this. I think it's just going to be, we need to focus on school finance. Right. We have to figure out a way to do that. The other ancillary issues, we'll get to those as well, but we have to do that. And to get back to your original question, you're right. I don't think it's just money. I think there has to be some other kind of metric or performance that we're looking at to make sure our schools are succeeding. Because the question I always ask is, they said, we need more money. And I say, okay, I'm with you. How much money do you need? And I never get an answer to how much money is full funding of education. Like, if you gave me this much money, you're telling me we have better test scores. If we had this much money, we'd have a better education system. If we had this much money, and until you can give me that number, where does that end? And so that's where I get frustrated with, let's just spend more money on it. No, there's got to be an efficient and effective way to spend it.
If you go, Representative Anchia, to the Krause metrics, the fact is, and we've heard this for years, there are states all over the country that spend a lot of money on students and don't produce results. I mean, there is not a straight line, conclusive, lock-it-down correlation between spending and performance. So if the metrics he's referring to are the metrics that unlock potential funding, that's challenging, is it not?
Well, it's really not. I often, as a businessman, I'm both a lawyer with the largest law firm in Dallas, a corporate finance lawyer, and I have my own private equity firm, real estate private equity firm. If I want to know how much something costs, I look at the private market, right? It's very simple. And what does the private market say about a world-class education in Austin, Texas, or Dallas, Texas, or Houston, Texas? How much? What does it tell you, right? The private market tells you that it's north of $20,000. Maybe even north of $25,000 to get a world class. For those who can pay in the private market, what does the private market charge for that service? $25,000, let's say. Just put it right there. And so I think that's more or less, to get a world-class education, how much it costs. Now, our Constitution doesn't say world-class education. It doesn't say globally competitive. It says adequate. So you all go out there and be adequate today. Tell your employer you're just going to do an adequate job today. Dallas Cowboys or Houston Texans, when we root for them, we're going to say go out there offense and be adequate. If Texas is going to continue to be the 10th largest economy in the world and globally competitive, I think we need to look beyond adequacy as the standard, and we need to look to the private market to tell us how much it costs.
Chair Morrison, property taxes you mentioned earlier as a component of this conversation, can't do one without the other. You know what happened at the end of last session with the property tax discussion. The discussion was we want to constrain the ability of local officials to raise property taxes above a certain threshold without bringing the voters into the conversation. The House was championed, I should say, in a lead role by your next speaker. The House said it's got to be 6%. The Senate said it had to be 4%. You all couldn't come to some agreement. Then that didn't get done. And then the governor came back in and said, after the session was over, hold my beer. Let's make it 2.5%. Clearly, this conversation, in large measure because Senator Paul Bettencourt is still alive and walking among us, is not going away, right? I mean, this is going to continue to be an issue. So how does the outcome next time look different than the outcome this time? If you couldn't agree last time, how are you going to agree this time? And if you don't solve it by your own admission, it's hard to solve public ed. What do you do?
It is. And the hard thing is it's different if you look at Houston, Texas, or Dallas, Texas, at where they are with their taxes, and you look at rural Texas. Because what it does to one community, it does something totally different to another. And so that's another issue we have to discuss is one size does not fit all for any of this. And you have to have those discussions. And recapture. I mean, in my district, most of my school districts have recapture, even though they're small, because of the Eagle Ford Shell.
Right.
Well, they're small, rural, poor districts, but they're sending money back to the state. Some of them are almost broke. So what you have to look at, one size does not fit everything, and that has to go into the equation. You just can't say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this percentage, because it does different things to different
So when your
counties.
local elected officials in your district come back and they say, you're making it impossible for us to provide the basic state services that our constituents demand from us by telling us how much we can and can't raise through the tax door. You're sympathetic to that argument.
Oh, absolutely. And, also, we have another issue that we're going to have to address this session. That's Hurricane Harvey.
Right. Your district was hit very hard.
My district was Rockport and Refugio and Victoria, and so that's another issue. And so some of these districts that have all these other issues have that issue on top of it.
Right.
That even their local governments don't have the money to operate. I mean, they've spent it, and so we've got to help that also.
I want to come back to Harvey because this will be a session in which we pass the first post-Harvey state budget. I want to ask about that in a second. But Representative Thierry, let me flip the property tax question around that I asked Representative Morrison, Chair Morrison. All that the proponents of this legislation, whether it's 6-4 or 2.5, all they're asking is that voters be given the chance to weigh in. If local elected officials want to raise the property tax above a certain threshold, why do you hate the will of the voters? Why do you hate democracy?
That's a little trick question. Obviously, I don't. But to Chairman Morrison's point, all of these are not, I think when we get to the table, they're not just piecemeal issues. We can't just look at this one piece of it. Yeah. In Houston, we want, everyone advocates for local control. We have a different set of needs in Houston and in Harris County. We were hit extremely hard by Hurricane Harvey. So, elephant in the room. We've got to talk about that, but then we've got to talk about the rainy day fund coming down into that, which would significantly change that conversation.
Right. But the principle, though, that voters should have an accountability mechanism on this property tax question. I mean, I've heard over the week, Representative Anchia and I have spent the last couple of days together doing legislative previews around the state, and what I've heard him say repeatedly is voters already have an accountability mechanism if the property tax goes up too much. It's called elections. If you don't like your mayor or your city council member or your county commissioner, if they raise taxes too high 2 years from now, pop them. You think that's the right answer?
Yeah, we're sitting here for a reason, and we sit here. I represent close to 180,000 constituents, right. So they'll make that call if they're not happy with that, and right. That's what I keep coming back to. That if we stick to what the issues are for our constituents this session, right. This is about our priorities. Right. All of us can come back home and say, "Look, we stood up for you on property taxes, on public education, on school safety, on mental health. These are all issues that are solvable, but until we get distracted. Right. Now, if we eliminate the franchise tax, then that changes our conversation also, because that's $1 billion we need.
It's a hole created in the budget, basically.
Absolutely.
If you do
so
that.
What we're talking about, we're talking about eliminating the franchise tax when we're trying to secure more funding for school finance.
Well, but people are talking.
Which was
fairness, I think
created
people
to
are talking
solve
about
that problem.
phasing it out rather than talking about it being gone in one fell swoop, right?
Sure.
Right.
But it was created to help the problem that we're now still trying to solve.
And
so
it underperformed.
Right.
She raises a great point about the franchise tax, right? Carol Keaton, Rylander, Strayhorn, John Cougar.
Mellencamp.
Yeah.
Right.
I got you.
She said when she was comptroller that franchise tax was going to produce about $5 billion less than it was projected to perform at when it was passed. So there was a recurring structural gap in the funding mechanism, and we've had that funding gap since 2006, okay? $5 billion per year, year over year. And we've done nothing to deal with that. And then we have reduced the scope and the performance of the franchise tax even further by creating more exemptions. Right. So that is an underperforming revenue stream. And now we're talking about phasing it out, and all the while we have never filled that gap and refilled the bucket for what it was supposed to perform. Because the franchise tax allowed us to buy down local property tax back in 2006. It underperformed. We never filled the bucket. Local property taxes went up. Right. It's just that simple.
Representative Krause, there are a couple of reasons, in fact, why property taxes have gone up. One is, in theory, the underfunding of public education has created this need for property taxes at the local level to go up to make up the difference. But the other is health care. All of us who live in the big cities know that people without health insurance show up at the county hospitals to get treated for things that they would otherwise go to the doctor to have treated. Those uncompensated care costs are passed along to all of us in our property taxes. I read at TexasTribune.org today that after 10 years of the population of uninsured children in this country declining, that for the first time in that decade, the population of uninsured children is now going up, and what do you know? Texas leads the way among all states in the number of uninsured children, 855,000 or more uninsured children in the state of Texas, more than any other state. Wouldn't it make sense to those of you, again, not you personally, but you royally, who want to see property taxes go down, that you fix health care? Wouldn't that naturally take property taxes down?
Well, I think anywhere you can save money in the budget will go to help that. I think you're always looking for places that you can do that. The question is, how do you solve that healthcare problem? I know a lot of people want Medicaid expansion as the way it was proposed under the ACA, but we've had a lot of discussions that it looks really good up front, and the short-term benefits look really great, but the more long-term benefits to the state, they're not as great, and it actually becomes a more financial burden on you.
You're not persuaded, Representative, by the red states that on November the 6th of this year, the voters of those red states overwhelmingly passed Medicaid expansion? You're not persuaded by the voters of those states that there's some reason to continue this conversation?
No, well, I mean, I'm always happy to have the conversation, but it doesn't persuade me that that's the step that Texas needs to take. I still think the long-term consequences and disadvantages more than make up for the short-term gains that you have, and in a couple of years, you're actually going to be off in a worse state than you would be. I think the question is, how do we get the federal government more out of that, block grants to the state so we can use it more efficiently and effectively, use our money in a better manner than trying to make sure that we go along with the ACA plan that could change over time, that's subject to the whims of the Secretary of HHS and those things. That's just too concerning for me to go into that program.
Chair Morrison, you are chair of the Transportation Committee now and may well be next. One conversation around revenue often relates to whether there's money to be generated from any change in fees. Should you raise the registration fee for cars? Should you raise the driver's license renewal fee? I think, in fact, the speaker may have suggested that at one point, floated that as a possibility. We're right now pouring a bunch of money, courtesy of the voters and the activity that you all undertook several sessions ago, into transportation every year. But, the toll conversation continues to come back. Where within the transportation world will we be talking about things, or should we be talking about things next session? What are the number 1 and 2 or 3 agenda items on that?
Money, money, money.
It's still about money.
It's still about money. Even though the 2 props that we did and the money that will be coming in, we are so far behind. I mean, when you have 1,000 new citizens daily in Texas, and half of those are moving here, I mean, you're just constantly behind, with your projects. And so it's all about that infrastructure. Hopefully we will get some help from the federal government. They seem to say infrastructure is a huge
Every
issue.
week is infrastructure week in this
Every
administration, isn't
week
it?
is infrastructure week.
Right.
But it's still about funds and, projects, and there are projects ready to go.
Yeah.
The good thing is, and we have to talk about the severance tax. Some of that money will be coming to us from the comptroller as that rolls in, but we also have some other uses for that.
Yeah.
We also have to look at, such as in my area where we have the Eagle Ford Shale, and up in the Permian Basin, all these counties that are paying for county roads that are being destroyed because of all the production that the counties are having to pay for.
You believe the oil production operators, the oil companies in those communities should be putting in more money to pay for the damage to roads created by the heavy truck activity?
There are a couple of bills, one that's already been filed about how to do some of that funding, but we have to help those counties. In my area, it's small counties, and they have done a good job of planning ahead.
Yeah.
But they know eventually too that their money will run out that they're receiving, and so all this money is going into the state coffers, but the counties are still paying for the roads.
Madam Chair, on the question of the funding mechanism created by the legislature or ratified by the voters several sessions ago, one theory of the case with that is that you guys actually solved a problem and created another one at the same point, in terms of the way the budget looks coming into every session, that you're now obligated to take that portion of money out of consideration to spend on other things. And unless I'm mistaken, I think you deferred a payment, did you not, in the last session?
Yes.
That's now going to have to be made up in the mother of all supplementals. You kicked
Right.
so many cans down the road from last session to this, you've got a 12-pack, right? You've got so many things loaded into this supplemental coming into this next session that it's going to be a big bite.
It will be a big bite.
Do you think in retrospect that you made a mistake in setting it up this way? Did you obligate the state to too much on an issue that clearly deserves attention, but by doing so created a hole in the budget that you all wish you hadn't created?
The issue is, if we don't have the infrastructure, then we can't have the new businesses coming. We can't, get transportation around the state to do the goods and everything. It's a very dicey issue, but it is still that we have to have the money for the infrastructure. We were talking this morning to the freshmen about what's going on down, at the border and all of the crossings and all the trucks coming and all the produce we have. And I mean, there's so many needs all around the state that it still is a money issue. I mean, we need that money. But you're right about supplemental because Hurricane Harvey's coming back on that too.
All right, so let's go to Harvey. Representative Thierry, let's talk about this. You're from Houston. Houston was obviously hard hit. It was not the only place that was hard hit. 22% of the state impacted. I heard the most alarming statistic of many alarming statistics I heard was Commissioner Morath testifying before the Senate Finance Committee several months ago, maybe 6 months ago at this point, saying that 1 out of every 4 kids enrolled in the Texas public schools had been impacted in some negative way by the hurricane, and that $1 billion in tax base was lost. And that's apparently some enormous order of magnitude greater than what was lost during Ike, for instance. So I thought the federal government was doing 90% of this, right? That 90% of the cost of the rebuild were going to be covered at the federal level, but that's still going to require the state to put in. Do you feel like, are you confident on behalf of your area of the state that you all will be made whole in this budget, and will that have consequences on your ability to spend on other things?
I hope we will. It really depends if how committed we are this session to give, but if there's so many constraints. From the federal level, it appears a lot of the funding is going to come from CDBG money, which is Community Development Block Grant money. However, that money is targeted for lower income residents. I represent communities where they don't meet exactly that threshold because they're middle-class, hardworking families, right, and they're not eligible for any of that money. So yes, I am going to be advocating for more. They've lost everything. As you said, they've relocated. Many of them are still living in apartments. But they don't meet the low-income requirement. We've asked for a waiver on that. We may not be getting it.
Right.
I don't know what we're going to do this session because we haven't heard of any specific allocations.
Yeah.
My mayor and the governor kind of got into a little
but
argument about
they hugged it out eventually. I thought
they did a bro hug and got it together. But
right,
we needed those dollars. We've asked for money from the rainy day fund, but we know that this is going to continue. I think the Trump administration just surprisingly agreed on a report that said climate change that the hurricane was the result of climate change, and that specifically in Texas and in Harris County that we have not done enough to prevent that.
Your assumption, though, the intimation of the state leaders at the last time we had this conversation in earnest around the time of the hurricane was that we're not going to take the money out of the rainy day fund now, but that the assumption was that the rainy day fund would be accessed to help pay down some of these costs. Do you have any reason to think that's not going to happen? I mean, the votes presumably are there in the legislature to do that, right?
It didn't happen. If we can finally start to have these conversations that it is not forbidden, that this money can be touched, and if for anything, right, then why not this?
I mean, it rained.
It rained, exactly, so that was my point. If not for this, then what?
Right.
But last session, and it's interesting you said that, I heard several members very vehemently against that and said, no, it should not come from that.
Chair Morrison, yes or no, you're for money coming out of the rainy day?
Absolutely.
On that,
yes.
Mr. Krause?
Absolutely.
Yes, and Mr. Anchia,
yes, and there's precedent for it. But we did the same thing for Galveston when it was hard hit.
Great. So let me pivot to the speaker's race quickly, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So, we in the press are not actually journalists. We're fight promoters. We like action. This is the first open speakers race in 25 years. I'm pulling for Ali Frazier. I want this to go 15 rounds, Thrilla in Manila. It turns out to be Cooney Norton. It's over in 50 seconds. It's the Thrilla in vanilla. Dennis Bonnen gets in this race late. He quickly locks up the votes. All the opposition to Bonnen fades. Suddenly, poof, we have a new speaker. Mr. Krause, the assumption going into this was that the Freedom Caucus was not going to be all about Dennis Bonnen, and then all of a sudden, blink and you miss it, the Freedom Caucus is now good with Dennis Bonnen. What happened there?
Well, I think dynamics change. You start vetting the candidates a little more closely, and I think...
Is he more conservative than you thought he was?
Well, I mean, for me personally, the second I heard that he was in the running for it, I was great with him. But I do think some of the other Freedom Caucus members looked at him and said, you know what, if you look at the Rice University rankings, which everybody universally seems to agree, that's a pretty good measure of where you are on the spectrum. Dennis Bonnen, I think, was 25th or 26th, and that was much better than anybody else who had filed. And so from that metric alone, I think you could say he was conservative.
You view him as a good alternative to the others at a minimum.
Yeah, I thought he would do a great job of giving every member a voice and allowing the process to play out. And that's what I was looking for, whether you're conservative or liberal. I wanted a speaker not that would ram down an agenda, but that would allow the members to work itself and to kind of organically have those issues come to the forefront. And I felt like he would do a really good job of that.
Has he given the Freedom Caucus or associated folks assurances that their legislation and their priorities and their politics will be given different treatment than the previous speaker did?
Well, not necessarily. I haven't gotten any assurances from anybody. It's one thing I actually appreciate about presumptive Speaker Bonin. He hasn't made any promises to anybody during this entire thing. Now, I think just organically it's going to happen to where you're not in that hole. You're not one of the 19 who's never going to get a bill passed. You're not one of this group that's not going to be able to have an influence on the session. So I think, yes, there will just be that natural tendency to be more part of the discussion this time. You look at the parliamentary group that he put together, Freedom Caucus members. It was a great cross-section of the House all over it. Freedom Caucus members, conservative, liberal, all across the spectrum. So if that's the way he runs the House, I think that bodes really well.
Chairman Anchia, when the presumptive speaker released his list of 109 names, it was 79 Republicans, so he had a majority of the majority, which was a necessary condition for any Republican one imagines to be the speaker designate. But he had 30 Democrats. He did not have you, but he had 30 Democrats. And after the election with 67 Democrats, the assumption was, well, God, if they hold together, then they actually have leverage in the speaker's race. That lasted about 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Right?
So,
but you're not one of those Bonin supporters yet.
So Dennis Bonin was able to do the unthinkable, which was keep the Republican caucus together. I mean, I thought that was, candidly, going into this process, the toughest execution to pull off. And if he runs the House anything like he ran his speaker's race, I think the state of Texas will be in a good spot. He ran circles around everybody else who was in the race, candidly. With respect to the Democrats sticking together, we were largely together. I thought for sure when we went from 55 to 67, we would play a bigger role. There were some Democrats who were already on the Bonin train and actively working for him. Although it was a smaller group, the reality is that he closed the deal in the Republican caucus. And when you close the deal in the Republican caucus, that means you've got the votes. And at that point, 79 grows to 109 pretty quickly.
Because you don't want to be on the late train or left on the platform altogether. Right. If the train is leaving, be on it.
Now my reason for not supporting him is I'm the chair of the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus, and there was a very large number of my members that were very, very concerned about the tone of the last 2 or 3 sessions and the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've seen out of the House, most notably SB 4, but not exclusively. 10 findings of intentional discrimination against Latinos in voting rights matters, all of this spending on border security at a time when the border saw its lowest crossings in about 12 years. So we had felt that we had taken it on the chin for a long time now. And what I committed to Speaker Bonin was to create an opportunity for us to visit, to air our ideas and experiences based on the last couple of sessions, and we did that yesterday. And I think the outcome was really good yesterday.
But you're not on Team Bonin yet.
No, I need to sit down with him and work out a couple of things, and by no means get commitments or anything like that. But just I really want to pick his brain about a couple of different subjects about how the House may be run. I'm really, really happy and thankful that he put me on this committee with Chairwoman Morrison and Representative Krause. He's done and said all of the right things in this process, including the people who he's named to his transition team. They're very ecumenical. They care very much about the institution of the House. So all signs are very, very positive so far.
Let me encourage people to come on up. We're going to try to get in a couple questions here before we end. Chair Morrison, you came in the session after Chair Bonin, did you not, into the legislature? You're good with this? You're on board 100%, no reservations, no anxiety?
I think that every decision he has made so far has been a very positive decision for the House.
And Rep. Thierry, just a comment on,
on
this.
I had a couple of conversations with presumptive Speaker Representative Bonin prior to the process, and I don't mean to say this in any naivete way, but I believed him. I believe him. I believe him when he says he wants to lead in a different manner and to be effective. You have to look at it even from a pragmatic standpoint. He's, 47 years old. I'm sure he would like to be Speaker more than once. So even if he didn't mean it, if people were cynical, he wouldn't be effective. and he doesn't have to get reelected. So if he really
Right.
wants to leave a lasting legacy, I think and I believe that he is going to take a very measured, pragmatic approach.
Also, you're from Houston, and you're looking at a speaker, a lieutenant governor, and a governor, all of whom have ties to Houston. You won the lottery, it seems to me.
Yeah, we are trying to represent
right.
H-Town.
Sir, ma'am, we'll kind of do whatever well, I guess one here and then bunch there. So, sir.
Yes, from Governor Bush, Governor Abbott, Governor Perry, we've heard cut taxes, cut spending, cut fraud, waste, and corruption. Today, we've heard from the Budget Committee, we've heard from the House and the Senate, and everybody's saying we don't have enough money. So is anybody going to have the political courage to look for new revenue?
Chair Morrison, you want to talk about a gas tax?
I don't think we're going to have a gas tax
Yeah.
raise.
Are you going to have an
I don't
anything
think-
tax? Probably not in this legislature, right? An anything tax.
I do not see anything on the horizon for.
Yeah. So are
raising
we
any
looking at a
taxes.
budget that has sources of revenue generated only by growth in the economy and growth in the population, but not by any measure that you all pass for the purpose of putting more money into the budget?
I don't know. We'll see who the Ways and Means chairman is and let them deal with that.
Well, we know who it's not going
we
to
know-
be, right?
Right.
Bonin.
We know who it's not going to be. We'll see who the new chairman's going to be.
Yeah. Mr. Krause, since you're, like Chair Morrison, the person on the dais least likely to be for tax increases, are you even willing to entertain a conversation about that?
About a tax increase?
About some kind of an increase in fees or taxes that would bring revenue in organically to the budget?
No, I don't think that's where the conversation needs to start. I think you go down and make sure we are using our money efficiently, effectively, and wisely. You look at everything and make sure we're doing what we need to do. I know Jane Nelson filed a bill today on state contracting, or a couple of days ago, to make sure we do have truth in contracting. We're not losing money there. Our colleague, Representative Capriglione, says we're losing tens of millions of dollars in contracting errors over the years.
So
and
that
so
may be where you start.
Yeah, and so I think you start there, and then that's not where you start the conversation.
Ma'am.
So this morning, Chair Zerwas mentioned that school safety is one of the top priorities for Texans. So do you see the Texas House taking action, passing legislation on things like red flag law or closing background check loopholes, measures that have proven to be effective, that are low cost to the state, and that are supported by the majority of Texans? I know Representative Anchia has taken action on that in the past, so I'm particularly interested to hear from the other three panelists as well.
Well, Thierry, my memory is that the governor raised the possibility of a discussion about red flag laws at the front end of his effort to gather people to talk about this issue post Santa Fe. But then the political blowback against red flag laws came, and suddenly we were no longer talking about that. I hope I have the sequence of that right. You see any reason to think that's going to come back into the discussion?
I was listening to the panel early this morning, and I heard some of the members say they don't feel that we're going to have the will, the strength, or the might to do it, and I hope that's not the case. And I'll just point of personal privilege. I'm a mom whose daughter is now in public school, young age, and frankly, you all, as a mom and as a legislator, I'm terrified most of the time. Last week in my district, a student brought to school, a sophomore, a 9mm handgun with 16 magazines. He clearly was planning to annihilate the place. This wasn't a student that necessarily, I don't know his history, so we're trying to find a little bit more. Would there have been something to flag and let us know? But why can't we talk about that, and we can still keep the Second Amendment? But right now in Texas, I think we're missing the point. If you guys will indulge me a moment, it's not illegal for a 12-year-old to possess a 9mm gun with 16 magazines. Why is that the case in Texas? If they have parental permission, I mean, that just seems counterintuitive. A 9-year-old can have possession of an assault weapon in Texas. They cannot buy, a 17-year-old can't buy a beer. Now, you can't buy it, but you can possess it if your parents say okay. Right. So bigger than red flag laws, I think the governor and all involved, when he put together the task force, may be willing to start there. We don't have to take away adults' right to the Second Amendment, but I don't think the Second Amendment contemplated a 12-year-old or 13-year-old having a 9mm with 16 magazines.
Madam Chair, you know the politics of this legislature. Again, been here for a long time, know what it's like. There has been absolutely no appetite to have a conversation about restricting in any way gun access or gun rights in this legislature. You have any reason to think it'll be different this time?
I think the school issue will definitely be addressed for safety. As far as Second Amendment, I don't see changing.
Because
that.
the school safety issue seems to be offline from the gun issue, at least as it's been
Absolutely.
conducted to this point.
Correct.
Fairly
And
or unfairly, that's
and
how,
I think
that's
you
how
will
it's going.
find that all legislators want to work on the school safety issue and how we address that.
Got it, ma'am. Hi.
So my name is Corey Vessa, and I'm a recently elected school board member in Round Rock ISD, just north of here. And I can actually address both of those topics that we've been talking about. First, school safety. We are doing great things in Round Rock ISD in terms of school safety, expanding a program called Restorative Practice. It has been piloted at my school, where my son goes to school, and it's a program that basically helps kids be known. A lot of them just feel alone, and they so it really deals with social emotional learning.
Yeah.
And we raised the money. I raised the money in the PTA to pay for the rollout of this program because our district doesn't have the money to roll out it district-wide.
Right.
Why is that? Because we're spending $8,330 per student in Round Rock ISD. That's almost $1,000 less than the state average. And we're subject to recapture, and that amount goes down next year.
Right. Let me ask you to just ask a question, if
Okay,
you will, please.
so
Yeah, thank you.
I think they're linked. I think that school finance and school safety are linked because our best weapon against school violence is in the schools. But we don't have the money to implement those proven strategies. So I beseech you to give us more money. We need more money. You may think that we have enough, but we don't.
Mr. Chairman, talk former school board member to current school board member. Please answer that from that perspective. You understand what she's talking about.
Sure, and I'm grateful for the efforts that she's making. I think working on the kids is important, but you're not going to be able to harden your way out of this problem because, I mean, these changing culture is really good. Changing physical infrastructure is good. It's also very expensive, and it's inadequate. It's not the entire solution. You can't harden every church, every school, every concert, every retail establishment, everywhere where gun violence is occurring at an alarming rate throughout the country. It just so happens it happened at Santa Fe, and so we say, well, if just the exits were different, or if just they had these metal detectors, or if this, and that's part of the discussion, but it's not the entire discussion. And until we have background checks across the board to make sure bad guys don't get guns, or you don't have private sale exemptions like you did in Dallas, where the person who killed 7 peace officers in Dallas bought the gun at a big box store. Until you have some real common sense things that have broad support, hardening the schools is only just one piece of it. Changing the culture is just one piece of it. We do need more money to do those things, sure.
Mr. Krause, let me come to you, not intending to poke at you or anybody who comes down on this side of this issue, but let me ask you a question that I'm curious about as a journalist and as an American. You look at the polling on stepping up background checks, or the polling on reducing access to or banning high-capacity magazines. You look at the polling on banning bump stocks. You look at the polling on limiting access to certain types of firearms, and the public seems to be, by a large percentage, for changes in those laws. But elected officials in places like Texas seem not to be. Help me understand the connect between you all as representatives of people who may see this issue, at least according to the polls, differently than the actions that you take. What am I to make of that?
Yeah, so maybe two different levels on that. The first is more of a practical aspect. My college basketball coach used to always say, don't mistake activity for achievement. And so a lot of times when something happens or there's a tragedy, there's a rush to do something. We got to fix something. We got to do this. And necessarily what you're doing in the legislation you put in place would not have prevented the tragedy that you're talking about. And so I see a lot of these things and a lot of these polls, and I understand that the public is at certain places on this. But even if you did those things, you're not going to stop all the mass killings. You're not going to stop these incidents from happening. And so, are we just doing something to feel good, or are we actually doing something to solve the problem? The second layer is the constitutional provision. We do have the Second Amendment. It said this right shall not be infringed. And so even if it polls very highly, the Constitution does not change in that aspect. So if you want to amend or you want to take steps to amend the Constitution, you can do that. But everybody says, well, it's just the Second Amendment. Well, it is in the Constitution. It is a right in there. And so you can't just bypass and say, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It may not matter in other countries that don't have the same constitutional republic structure that we do, but in ours, it has a huge difference. And I think that's a big reason for a lot of us.
I got to object just really quickly on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment never contemplated any of these things, okay? Look, the Second Amendment doesn't prevent stopping private sales. The Second Amendment doesn't prevent you from having reasonable background checks. We know this. The Second Amendment, by the way, doesn't even allow you to have open carry or campus carry like we have here in Texas. No court has ever found in the history of the United States that I can tell, that I've researched, that you're entitled to open carry or campus carry because of the Second Amendment. It's just not true. Now, we have done things statutorily to, in my view, increase the risk that these things will happen. I'm a lawyer. I'm a corporate finance lawyer. When I counsel my clients, it's all about reducing risk, right? Maybe not one of these things will result in stopping each of these tragedies that we're experiencing, but cumulatively, these things will reduce risk. And we see it in other countries that have laws like this, and I do not think that the Second Amendment allows us or prevents us as policymakers from reducing the risk of gun violence in society, period, full stop.
Yeah. I feel like I'm the debate moderator here. 30 seconds, please.
No, just real quick. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have those discussions. I'm not even saying that you can't look at.
But we've been having those discussions, Matt. I mean, we've been seeing people get murdered all over this country. And when do we stop having the discussion and do something?
Well,
Mr.
you got
Krause,
to make.
go ahead.
You got to make sure that what you're doing actually stops what's going on. Everything that you listed that we needed to do better to lessen the risk is not going to stop necessarily what happened in Representative Thierry's school just the other day.
It might have saved 7 peace officers.
It may
in
have,
Dallas.
but it may not have.
Saved them.
Well, if it wasn't even illegal for his parents to let him have access to the gun. So let's start with some baby steps. Would you be in favor of even having a law?
Well, so then the kids who go out on the deer lease on the weekend to shoot their guns or sports shooting,
possession of their parent, maybe in the presence of their parents, a rifle. There's ways we can do this. We don't have to throw it all out. I think there's sensible solutions without gutting it all, is what I believe, Representative.
I'm going to bring another question into this conversation. Go ahead.
Not to change the subject, but so a bill was filed to end in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants.
I believe it was Representative Biederman, was it not, who filed that bill?
Do you think we're going to see more legislation like that? And is there a will to pass, to,
Let us do a kind of in deference to time, kind of a game show speed round. Do you believe that in-state tuition for, in this instance, would be eliminated in this session? Is it going to be a live issue, Representative Thierry?
No.
Chair Morrison, do you think it'll be a live issue?
I don't know. I don't know whether it will be or not. There really has not been a discussion for many years.
You would have been in the legislature when the bill passed originally.
Yes.
Were you not? Did you vote for it?
I did.
Yeah. Has your opinion on the subject changed?
My opinion is that we need to make sure that we have enough money to educate our students, and I will say I'm very concerned about higher education because it has not been a high priority the last couple of sessions on funding.
Right, and you're a member of that committee.
And member of that committee,
right.
And I think it's something we really need to look at is the funding of higher education and how higher education works.
Right, Mr. Krause.
I'm not sure just because we don't know the makeup of the House, the committees and all that, but as Representative Anchia and I were talking about earlier this week, I think the House is probably going to, in the other direction, we're going to spend a lot of time reinforcing our relationship with Mexico, how negative impact tariffs can have and how much free trade we need to have. So I think we're actually probably going to spend more time that direction.
Personally, are you a vote against in-state tuition of the sort we're discussing here?
Well, I'd have to see what the actual bill language looked like. I understand the thought that, if you're here illegally, then why would you have to pay, why would you get a more of a benefit than somebody in Oklahoma or Louisiana coming across? But I also think a lot of these kids, they didn't choose to come here illegally. They've been here for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, so it's not like it's a magnet to bring people in, and I think that's a legitimate part of the conversation.
Is this one of those sharp objects on the table that will not be on the table this session?
It is, and let me explain why we have in-state tuition for people from Arkansas or from Sinaloa. We have in-state tuition because people and their parents for a time certain have contributed the taxes, whether they're documented or undocumented, as Texas residents. They are residents of Texas and have paid the same sales taxes that we all pay that help fund our higher education system, right? So if you are undocumented, you have a higher standard. You will have had to be a resident and paid into the system for 5 years. If you are from Arkansas, you only have to live here for 1 year. So the burden is higher for undocumented students. But keep in mind, in both cases, they are residents of the state of Texas. And that is why we give people who are residents of the state of Texas, for a time certain, a tuition break, because they and their families have paid into the system.
And can I add one more thing?
I wish you would, and that'll be our last word. Yes, ma'am.
The other thing is, too, there is a requirement that the students have to have attended high school for 4 years.
There are a series of tripwires, right? Yeah.
There is. It's not just you just receive it. There are stipulations that were laid out when the bill was passed.
Right. We need to stop here in deference to the rest of our day and the time given to us generously by our panelists. Please give a big hand and thank Representative Anchia, Krause, Morrison, and Thierry.